Hi, my name is Ken Davidian, and today I'm going to talk to the topic of commercial space today. It seems like there's a resurgence, but exactly of what? So this question of whether there's a resurgence assumes that there was an initial surge. And when we're talking about commercial space, we're quickly going to get to the question of what is commercial? What do you mean by commercial? And a lot of other markets don't ask this question. They just don't feel the need to ask it because they just are doing business. And even different markets that are working with the government as well as mass market consumers, they don't have to ask this question. So it seems like it's a funny question, but it seems very relevant because other industries and other professions have dealt with this. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Is there a resurgence of commercial space? Obviously, we have companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin that have been working in the space arena with NASA, for example, and with the Air Force and now the Space Force for many, many years. But was that really commercial just because a non-governmental entity was providing that service to the government? It was industry for sure, but was it in fact commercial? Today, you have other companies like SpaceX, like Blue Origin, like Virgin Galactic that are doing work in the space markets, working with NASA, but also working with mass consumers, let's say. And so is that commercial? You'll have individual companies like SpaceX that are just won a contract to put a human landing system on the moon for NASA. Again, is that commercial? But at the same time, they're developing a starship that can take people to Mars ultimately. There's no customers for that, but it's something that is being done. So is that commercial? And of course, Virgin Galactic and Blue Origin with the suborbital tourism, that is absolutely going on. And what's beautiful there is that even though they are serving a little bit of a government customer by flying experiments, and now the government is looking at maybe even letting people fly on these vehicles to conduct research. These companies, both Blue Origin and Virgin, both have a large number of customers lined up, non-governmental customers, to fly on those vehicles. So maybe that's commercial. So basically, we ultimately want to find out, what does the word commercial mean? And there have been many, many attempts at trying to identify this in the past. Myself and a bunch of other industry analysts have combed the different types of documents and policies that have been written to try to identify what are the characteristics of commercial. And we found a lot of different types of characteristics, but we've never been able to come up with a hard and fast, specific definition that really nails it down. And I think one of the problems that we've encountered, or one of the challenges that we're trying to overcome, is that we're trying to define it in a dichotomous way, in a way that says this is commercial and that is not commercial. And in fact, that's not the way the world works. I mean, other types of professions, sociologists and social scientists have had this kind of issue in the past. For example, historians and archaeologists have tried to identify what does it mean for a society to be civilized. It used to be that societies were characterized as civilized or uncivilized. And over time, the more common way of talking about this is that there are multiple dimensions or characteristics that a social grouping has. And they'll have some level of each of these characteristics. For example, they could be characterized like dials going from 0 to 10. And each of these dials can be at some number between 0 and 10, depicting the amount, the degree of that characteristic. And these characteristics can be mutually dependent, covariant. So when you turn one up, another one turns up, and they can have nonlinear relationships. We don't really understand all those relationships and all those interconnections, but we do understand that a social grouping is not one or the other. It's not a dichotomy. It's a continuum. The idea of civilization is a continuum and has multiple dimensions. And in fact, that's sort of the line of thinking that we want to bring to the definition of the word commercial. The definition of the word commercial probably has multiple dimensions, and I think that's what we were looking for when we were doing our analyses of all the different policy documents. More recently, I have been focusing on some organization theory concepts of different motors of change, looking at market levels of analysis, meaning not individuals and not firms, not companies, but groups of firms as an industry segment, or groups of industry segments as an industry. For example, we could be talking about liquid rocket engine companies, multiple companies that are making liquid rocket engines, or multiple companies that are making solid rocket motors. Each of those is an industry segment for an overall industry that we might call propulsion, the propulsion industry. So we're looking at these levels of analysis, trying to identify what makes these activities commercial or not. Well, it turns out in org theory, they've identified 4 ideal motors of change. These are the types of forces that are stimulating innovation in that industry. And when we talk about industry emergence, when we talk about the change within an industry, we're effectively talking about innovation. So what creates the stimulus for innovation? And one of the 4 motors of change is called the evolution motor of change. In the evolution motor, you have 3 individual forces that act in sequence on a given innovation, on a given group of innovations. And these 3 forces are called variation, selection, and retention. So our concept of what is commercial is based on the idea that any innovation going on in an industry is going to be subject to variation forces, and that could be characterized by the number of innovative ideas that are competing with one another. Competition is one of the main characteristics of the evolution motor of change. So the number of different technologies, different innovations that are competing with each other, that could be a proxy for the strength of the variation force. The second force, the selection force, this is what determines which variations should be developed and matured. And in a lot of societies, what the function that exerts the selection force is the capital market, the funding sources. Where is the money, the investment that helps stimulate these innovations to help develop them? And so the funding levels and the number of independent funding sources could be a proxy for this selection force in the evolution motor. And third, the retention force is what decides what innovations are ultimately kept in the market. And it seems clear that a proxy for the retention force could be the number of independent sources of demand, how many customers are there, and the level of demand. Is it a small amount of demand or is it a large amount of demand? So you might have one customer that's very big, have a large amount of demand, but a single independent customer like the government, or you might have a lot of individual customers, but all their demand adds up to a very small number. So both the number is important as well as the amount. So we have variation, selection, and retention. So these 3 forces act in a sequence, but are always present in a marketplace. And my assertion would be that the stronger the variation force, the stronger the selection force, and the stronger the retention force, the more this market could be considered commercial. So again, it's not a dichotomy, but it goes from a little bit commercial to a very strongly commercial. So where you are on that continuum will depend on the strength of these 3 forces: variation, selection, retention. Now, as an engineer, I always kind of think in 3-dimensional space: x-axis, y-axis, and z-axis. It's a very common depiction, using your fingers like this to show the 3 axes. And so it could be that you put each of these forces on an axis. So that would say, if you have a vector along the x-axis, that could depict the variation force. And again, I was talking about the number of innovations. So having a single idea put out and produced to supply a given market, that's not a lot of variation. In fact, that's zero variation. That's a single idea. It's not multiple ideas competing. So that characterizes a plane in that three-dimensional space. And the plane that has zero variation, but maybe a lot of selection, maybe a lot of funding sources, and maybe a lot of demand, that plane could be characterized as the monopoly market. That's where there's no variation. You have one supplier, but you have a lot of people that need it and a lot of funders of it. And you could think of the electricity market. Electrical power is important. There's a lot of individual investors there, and there's a high demand for it. Everybody needs electricity, but there's only one, you have one choice. Now that's changing over time, but that's an example of a monopoly market. If you have a situation where variation might be large, but selection is zero, you have one funding source, and maybe demand is high, now what you've got is a state-owned enterprise market. This is where you have one funder, and that could be, let's say, the state. And so there are many countries where they have many markets where the state is the sole funder. So that is another one of the planes in this three-dimensional space. And the third plane is characterized when there is no retention force. There's no customers. Maybe there's a single customer, which means there's not multiple customers. So there's not a lot of variation. You're sort of captive to that one customer. You might have a lot of variation, a lot of innovation, and you might have a lot of selection, a lot of funding sources, but you only have one customer. And that's called a monopsony market. And that characterizes the way the space industry was in the United States, at least in the early, 1960s, let's say. Now I'm talking about thinking mostly of launch vehicles, because the telecommunications satellite business has had private investors there. They've had many, many customers through the satellite television and television broadcasts. But for the most part, in terms of launch vehicles, it's been a government funded, a government variation, government innovations, and government demand. So that's even a more special case than a plane in those three-dimensional space. That's the origin point. That's 0, 0, 0. Zero variation in innovation, zero in terms of multiple funding sources, and zero in terms of multiple demand sources. So given all that, that's the origin of the axis. And that's a super special market where it's just totally government run for government purposes. And there might be good reasons for that. I'm not saying that this is a bad thing. There are certain things that a citizen needs, that a nation needs, and these are considered the rights of their citizenry. And so it might be absolutely appropriate for the government to go out and provide that for their citizens. They would say, here's how we're going to solve the problem, here's how we're going to fund it, and we're going to be the only people that buy it so it can be distributed freely to our citizens. And that is absolutely appropriate. But there are other things which maybe we consider them rights or privileges instead of rights. These are things which maybe the government shouldn't be the only customer for. So considering, for example, space tourism. This is considered by many to be a joyride for rich people. However, other people say, hey, listen, this is the way markets emerge. They start out very expensive, very exclusive, and maybe even very dangerous. Think of the automobile way back when. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a law that required a person to run in front of a car waving a red flag to make sure people were aware it was coming so that they wouldn't be hurt. So they were very expensive at the time. Only the very rich could afford them. But of course, over time, they became more and more affordable and everybody uses them. They're still not a right of everybody. They're still a privilege, but they became more common and more diffused throughout the society. So there are a lot of different ways of looking at how to define the word commercial, and using the variation, selection, and retention motor is one way of doing that. So the question is there a resurgence? And the answer is, well, maybe. I mean, there's a lot of companies now that are in the market, but they're trying to get the government as a customer. So there might be a resurgence of that kind of market. There's a lot of variation, a lot of private money going into it. but the government tends to be the customer, and for the purpose of space exploration, which is fantastic. There is this movement toward developing mass markets for space tourism, for example, and that is absolutely great. It's probably the first time in the space transportation industry this is happening. So maybe it's not really just a resurgence there, but a resurgence. It's moving forward, and we're absolutely glad to see that. In any case, defining the word commercial is very, very difficult, but it helps us identify different characteristics that could be indicators of how commercial a market is. We're working to develop theory around this, and we welcome any type of engagement, any type of discussion, and any type of questions and comments that you might have. Thank you very much.